The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago came home 3 days early, and that very night, the men of steel who guarded the Romano family witnessed something they had never dared to imagine in all their years of service. Their boss shedding tears. Not because of a bullet, not because of a betrayal, but because of a 3-year-old child and a pair of shoes smeared with polish. Adrienne Romano was 39 years old. His name made crime syndicates from the East Coast to the West lower their voices whenever it was spoken. The Romano family's underground empire stretched across America, weaving through harbors, casinos, and networks that federal agents had chased for 2 decades without ever touching. Above that layer of darkness stood a legitimate investment corporation worth tens of billions of dollars, its glass towers bearing the Romano name rising over downtown Chicago. People said Adrienne could buy an entire city block with a single phone call and erase a man's name from this city with a single nod. But there was one truth no newspaper ever printed, no rival ever knew. The Romano estate, a gray stone mansion sitting on 12 acres outside the city, where dozens of guards patrolled day and night, and servants moved like shadows, had not heard a single burst of laughter in 7 years. Not because laughter was forbidden, but because no one dared. The cold did not come from the marble floors or the tall windows. It radiated from the man who owned it all. Adrienne had not been born cold. He had been made that way, one loss at a time. Many years ago, his father and mother were taken from him in a single night, a purge orchestrated by a rival family, a strike so swift that by the time Adrienne reached the hospital, all that remained for him were 2 sheets of white cloth and the smell of antiseptic. He was young then. He buried his parents on a rainy Tuesday, and by Friday he had taken control of everything they left behind. The boy disappeared into the ground with the coffins. What climbed out of that cemetery was something else entirely. Yet even then, one small ember still glowed inside him. Her name was Isabella, his fiancée, the woman he had planned to build a different life with, perhaps even a way out of the darkness. Adrienne gave her the one thing he had never given anyone: his trust. He told her things no lieutenant knew, showed her doors no bodyguard had ever passed through, and Isabella sold every one of those secrets to his enemies, traded his heart for a seat at a rival's table, for power that glittered brighter than any promise he could make. Adrienne survived the ambush that followed. 3 of his men did not. From that day forward, he carved a single truth into his bones: every attachment is a weakness, and every weakness is a death sentence. He stopped keeping photographs. He stopped celebrating birthdays. He ate alone at a dining table built for 20, and the staff learned to set 1 plate without being told. The empire grew larger every year. The man inside it grew smaller. Inside that frozen fortress, there was one person who moved differently from the rest. Her name was Zoe Williams, 32 years old, the head housekeeper of the estate. She had walked through the service entrance for the first time at 25, a young cleaner with steady hands and a spine that never bent, and within a few short years, she had risen to become the youngest head housekeeper in the history of the Romano household, a position old men had held for generations before her. The senior staff whispered that no one had ever polished the family silver the way Grace did, as if every spoon carried someone's dignity in it. Life had not been gentle with her either. Her husband had been a firefighter, the kind of man who ran toward burning buildings while everyone else ran away. 2 years ago, he went into a collapsing apartment block to pull out a stranger's son and never walked out. He left Grace a folded flag, a modest pension that vanished into rent and hospital bills, and a daughter named Zoe, who had just turned 1 when her father's helmet came home without him. Grace never remarried. She never complained. A babysitter cost more than half her weekly wages, so every morning before sunrise, she bundled her daughter into a worn coat and brought her along to the small staff cottage behind the mansion, where Zoe played quietly among folded laundry, while her mother kept a billionaire's world spotless. Adrienne had seen the little girl perhaps a handful of times, always by accident. A tiny thing with round cheeks and enormous dark eyes, 3 years old, forever hiding behind her mother's legs the moment he appeared. She clutched an old teddy bear wherever she went, its fur rubbed thin, one ear stitched back on, with mismatched thread, the last gift her father had ever bought her. Not once had she dared to look the terrifying master of the house in the eye, and not once had Adrienne bothered to learn what her voice sounded like. Children belonged to a world he had closed the door on long ago. Then came the war in New York. A rival family had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and Adrienne flew east to end it himself. The negotiations were supposed to take a week. They took 4 days. The other side folded faster than anyone predicted. Terms were signed, territory was redrawn, and suddenly Adrienne found himself standing in a hotel suite, with 3 empty days stretching before him like an unfamiliar road. He told no one he was coming home. No calls ahead, no convoy waiting, no staff lined up at the front steps rehearsing their greetings. For reasons he could not explain even to himself, he wanted to enter his own house the way he had as a teenager, through the side door by the garage, the narrow passage he once used to slip past his father's study after curfew. It was the only door in the entire estate that still remembered the boy he used to be. The car rolled through the back gate, a little after 9 in the evening. Adrienne stepped out alone, loosened his tie, and walked toward that small side door in the dark. He did not know it yet, but behind that door, on that ordinary Tuesday night, waited the one thing his entire empire had never been able to give him. The side door opened without a sound, exactly as it had 25 years ago. Adrienne stepped into the narrow corridor that led past the garage toward the boot room, where generations of Romano men had changed their shoes before entering the main house. The lights were dimmed for the night. Only a thin yellow glow spilled from beneath one door at the end of the hall. He was 3 steps in when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic scratching bristles moving across leather, slow and patient, over and over. And beneath that sound, threading through it, something he could not place at first because it did not belong anywhere in this house. A tiny voice, humming. The melody wobbled and wandered off key, but he recognized its shape. A lullaby, the kind of tune a mother sings over a crib, half words and half breath, the kind of music the walls of this mansion had never once absorbed. Adrienne stopped walking. Something in his chest, some instinct older than caution, told him to be quiet. The door to the shoeshine room stood ajar. He moved toward the strip of light and looked through the gap. On the low wooden stool where the staff kept their brushes, a small figure was perched on tiptoe, straining upward to reach the rack. It was the girl, Grace's daughter, Zoe. Her tiny hands were black to the wrists with shoe polish. Dark smudges streaked across one round cheek and the tip of her nose, and the sleeve of her pajama top had soaked up a long stripe of it. Her tongue poked out of the corner of her mouth. Her small brows knotted in ferocious concentration as she pressed an old rag along the stitching of a black leather shoe. His shoe, the Oxfords he wore to meetings where grown men trembled. She worked the cloth along each seam with exaggerated care, then held the shoe up toward the lamp, turned it left, turned it right, squinting the way a jeweler examines a diamond. Then she nodded to herself, set it down, dipped the brush again, and resumed every motion, a faithful, miniature copy of gestures she must have watched her mother perform hundreds of times. The dipping of the brush, the 3 small taps against the tin, the long, even strokes from heel to toe. A 3-year-old performing a ritual she did not understand, guided only by love and memory. Beside the stool sat the teddy bear with the mismatched ear, propped against the wall like a supervisor on duty. Adrienne had stood in rooms where men begged for their lives. He had stared down the barrels of guns without his pulse rising a single beat. He had no name for what was happening to him now, standing frozen in a dark hallway, watching a child polish his shoes at 9 o'clock at night. The floorboard shifted under his weight. Zoe spun around. The tin of polish flew from her startled hands, struck the floor, and rolled in a wide circle before wobbling to a stop against his shoe, the one he was wearing. The humming died. The little girl looked up, and up, and up, until her eyes found the face of the man who owned everything around her. All the blood drained from her cheeks. She scrambled off the stool so fast she nearly fell, and then she stood there, tiny and trembling, head bowed so low her chin touched her chest. "I'm sorry." Her voice was barely bigger than a whisper. I clean it all up." She dropped to her knees and began wiping the floor with her rag, wiping frantically, smearing the polish wider with every stroke, her small shoulders shaking. "Stop." The word came out of him rougher than he intended, the voice he used on men twice her size. Zoe froze as if struck. Adrienne saw it, saw the flinch travel through her whole body, and something twisted behind his ribs. He crouched down slowly, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers, the way no one in this house had ever seen Adrienne Romano lower himself for anyone. "What are you doing here?" he asked, quieter now. "It's late. Where is your mother?" Zoe's lip quivered. Her eyes, enormous and glassy, were rimmed red, not from crying, he realized, but from fighting not to. "Mama is sick," she whispered, Mama is very hot. Here." She touched her own forehead with one blackened finger. Mama said, "Tomorrow she has to shine the shoes for you, sir." Mama said it in her sleep. "If Mama can't do the work," the little chin wobbled. "If Mama can't do the work, Mama gets sent away. Then we don't have home no more." Each broken sentence landed on Adrienne like a fist. "So I do it," Zoe went on, the words tumbling out now, desperate to explain before punishment came. "I watch Mama do it lots and lots. First the brush, then the black cream, then rub in circles. I know how. I'm big now. I do it so Mama can sleep and nobody sends Mama away." Adrienne could not speak. He had commanded the erasure of an entire crew, once men who had crossed his family, and his heart rate had not changed. He had listened, expressionless, while grown men wept and offered him money, loyalty, their own brothers. His entire life, every human being who approached him wanted something from him, or feared something in him. Every hand extended toward Adrienne Romano had come to take. His money, his power, his secrets, his name. Even Isabella, especially Isabella. And here, kneeling on the cold floor of a shoe room, was a child who could not yet reach the top of the rack, who had crept out of bed while her sick mother slept, who had ruined her pajamas and stained her hands black, and she wanted nothing from him at all. She had come to give her mother one more day of safety, to give a stranger's shoes the best shine her 3-year-old hands could manage, believing with her whole heart that this would hold her small world together. She was afraid of him. She had done it anyway. Zoe lifted the shoe she had been working on and held it out to him with both hands, the way one presents an offering. Fear and hope fought openly on her smudged little face, and hope recklessly, impossibly was winning. "Did I," she asked, "did I shine it pretty, sir?" The shoe was a disaster. Polish clotted along the seams, dull swirls crossed the toe cap. One lace had been dunked entirely in black. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for him, something deep inside Adrienne's chest, something that had been frozen solid for 7 years, wrapped in steel, and buried under an empire cracked. He heard it give way, felt the fracture run through him like ice breaking on a lake. He did not decide to cry. The decision was never his. The tears simply came, hot and sudden and unstoppable, blurring the sight of the small girl and the ruined shoe and the teddy bear leaning against the wall. And there, on the floor of the shoeshine room, before a 3-year-old holding his Oxford in her polish-stained hands, the most feared man in Chicago sank to his knees. Zoe was the one who broke the silence. She set the shoe down, shuffled forward, and pressed her small rag into Adrienne's hand, the cleanest corner she could find. "Don't cry, sir," she whispered, with the gravity of someone sharing a family secret. "Mama says crying is okay. Crying lets the sad out. But then you wipe." A sound escaped Adrienne that he had not made in years, half breath, half broken laugh. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the rag still clutched uselessly in his fist, and stood. "Take me to your mother." Zoe grabbed her teddy bear by one arm and led him through the sleeping corridors, her bare feet slapping softly against the marble, one polish-stained hand gripping 2 of his fingers, as if she had done it all her life. The staff cottage behind the mansion was dark except for a single lamp. Zoe pushed open the last door with both hands. The room was barely larger than Adrienne's closet. A narrow bed, a folding chair, a child's drawings taped to the wall in careful rows, and on the bed, shivering beneath a thin blanket, lay Grace Williams. Her face was gray, her hair soaked flat against her forehead, her lips cracked and colorless. The heat radiating off her body reached Adrienne from the doorway. When her fever-glazed eyes focused and recognized the man standing in her room at 10 o'clock at night, pure terror did what the illness could not. It pulled her upright. "Mr. Romano." Her voice tore. She was already trying to swing her legs off the bed, already reaching for the robe on the chair, already apologizing with her whole trembling body. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were returning tonight. The evening rounds. I'll lie down." She froze, halfway to standing, swaying. "I meant to push through until you came back," she whispered, and the shame in her voice was worse than the fever. "It's only a flu. I didn't want anyone troubled over me. The work was going to be done, sir. I swear the work was going to be done." Adrienne crossed the room and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. She flinched at the contact. The master of the house did not touch the staff, did not enter this cottage, did not exist in this half of the world. Her skin scalded him. 40 degrees, or close enough to make no difference. How long? He asked. Grace's eyes slid away. 2 days, she admitted. Who knew? The silence answered for her. And in that silence, Adrienne understood everything. The logistics manager who scheduled the staff had known. The house steward who assigned the rounds had known. Half the kitchen had probably known. And not one of them had considered it worth a single line in the nightly reports that reached his desk. No matter where in the world he was, reports that tracked the pressure in the boiler room and the mileage on the cars. A machine breaking down warranted a report. A woman breaking down did not, because somewhere along the 7 frozen years, his entire household had absorbed the lesson he taught them, that the people inside these walls were invisible, and their pain was beneath his attention. The rage that rose in Adrienne then was unlike anything the underworld had ever seen from him. His famous anger was liquid nitrogen, quiet, controlled, colder with every word. This was fire. This was the anger of a man looking at his own reflection and despising it. Zoe, he said, very gently, stay with your mama. Then he walked out into the night and made one phone call. 11 minutes later, the great hall of the Romano mansion blazed with light, and men in hastily buttoned shirts stood in a line that stretched the length of the room. The house steward, the security shift leads, the kitchen head, and at the center, the logistics manager, a thick-necked man named Dunn who had held his post for 11 comfortable years. No one had seen the boss summon the full household staff since the funeral of his father. No one spoke. The only sound was Adrienne's footsteps on the marble as he walked the line once, slowly, and stopped in front of Dunn. Grace Williams has been running a 40-degree fever for 2 days, Adrienne said. His voice never rose. It did not need to. She cleaned this house for 2 days while she could barely stand. Her 3-year-old daughter was so afraid of what would happen if the work went undone that she got out of bed tonight to shine my shoes herself. He let that image hang in the burning silence. You knew. You rearranged her rounds to cover the gaps. You put it in no report. Dunn's throat worked. Sir, with respect, she's housekeeping staff. I didn't think a housekeeper's flu was worth the boss's. You didn't think a human being collapsing under my roof was worth my time. Adrienne stepped closer. You were right about one thing, Dunn. For 7 years, I built a house where that was true. That house dies tonight. He turned to face the entire line. Hear me once, because I will not repeat it. In this estate, from this day forward, no one is invisible. Not a guard, not a cook, not a gardener's child. If someone under this roof is sick, hurt, or in trouble, it reaches me before the weather report does. Anyone who finds that beneath them can walk out that door tonight with my blessing. Then, without raising his voice a fraction, Done. You're relieved of your position. Severance, per your contract. Be gone by morning. He was already walking away before the man could answer. Wake Dr. Moretz. I want him at the staff cottage, in 30 minutes. And someone bring me the payroll ledger. Grace Williams is on full salary until the day the doctor clears her, and not 1 day sooner. Doctor. Moretz arrived in 26 minutes, still wearing his pajama collar under his coat, and disappeared into Grace's room with his black bag. Adrienne stood outside in the narrow corridor of the cottage, and it was there that he found her. Zoe sat alone on the floor against the wall, knees pulled up to her chin, the teddy bear squeezed under one arm, and in her lap, held with both hands, the way other children hold a favorite toy, the battered tin of shoe polish. She had refused to let anyone take it from her. Her eyes were fixed on her mother's door, and her small face carried a weight no 3-year-old face should know how to carry. Adrienne looked down at her. Then the most feared man in Chicago, in a suit that cost more than this entire cottage, lowered himself and sat flat on the cold floor beside a child, his back against the same wall, his long legs stretched out next to her tiny bare feet. For a while, neither of them said anything. The murmur of the doctor's voice drifted through the door. Sir? Zoe's whisper finally came, so quiet he had to lean down. Are you mad at me? No. Her fingers tightened around the tin. Because of me, everybody waked up, and the loud man got in trouble. And, she hesitated, arriving at the true center of her fear. And I shined not pretty. There's smudges, I saw. Adrienne looked down at his feet. He was still wearing them. He had put them on in the shoe room without thinking, the Oxfords she had labored over. Polish clumped along the seams. Dull clouds swirled across the toes. One lace dyed black to the tip. Tomorrow, the world's most dangerous men would look at those shoes and wonder if the great Adrienne Romano had lost his mind. Zoe. He said her name for the first time and found that it fit easily in his mouth. I have worn shoes from the finest makers in Italy. Shoes that cost more than a car. Men have polished them in 5 countries. She peeked up at him, braced for the verdict. These, Adrienne said, are the most beautiful shoes I have ever worn. Zoe stared at him. Then, slowly, like a sunrise deciding to happen, the fear melted off her face, and something radiant took its place, and Adrienne felt his own face move in a way that had become foreign to it, the pull of muscles unused for 7 years, unfamiliar and aching, and entirely beyond his control. Adrienne Romano smiled. At the far end of the corridor, the night guard on cottage duty stood motionless at his post, absolutely certain that no one would ever believe him. The order came down the next morning, delivered in Adrienne's usual flat tone, and received by the household like a thunderclap. Grace Williams and her daughter were to be moved out of the staff cottage and into the guest wing of the main house, the wing reserved, in the old days, for visiting dons and senators. A private chef would prepare their meals 3 times a day for as long as Grace's recovery lasted. When the new steward hesitated and asked whether the boss meant the smaller guest rooms near the service stairs, Adrienne looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, and the man decided that no, the boss meant the wing with the garden view. Grace protested, of course. From beneath her blankets, hoarse and mortified, she attempted to negotiate herself back down to the cottage, the way other people negotiated for their lives. Adrienne listened patiently, nodded once, and had her belongings moved anyway. It was the first argument Grace Williams ever lost without a fight being permitted to occur, and so began the strangest week in the history of the Romano estate. It started with the knocking. The first morning, at 7 o'clock sharp, Adrienne was adjusting his cufflinks when he heard a knock so small and so low on the door that for a moment he thought a bird had struck the wood. He opened the door and found no one at eye level. Then he looked down. Zoe stood in the corridor in her pajamas, arms wrapped around his black Oxfords, holding them up like a trophy she could barely lift. "Today I shined more pretty than yesterday," she announced. She had, marginally. The smudges had migrated from the toes to the heels, which Zoe seemed to regard as strategic progress. Adrienne accepted the shoes with the solemnity of a man receiving a state honor, examined them under the light while she held her breath, and confirmed that this was, indeed, superior work. Zoe nodded once professional to professional and padded away with her teddy bear dragging behind her. The knock came again the next morning, and the next. By the 4th day, Adrienne discovered that he had started waking up before his alarm, and that there was no other word for it, waiting. The tie happened on Thursday. Zoe had watched him loop the silk around his collar with wide-eyed fascination, then declared that she knew how, because she tied her shoes almost by herself, and it was the same thing. It was not the same thing. What Zoe produced after 4 minutes of ferocious effort, tongue out, brows locked, was not a Windsor knot or any knot catalogued by civilization. It was a defiant lump of silk sitting off-center beneath his collar, one tail hanging a full hand longer than the other. "There," she said, patting it. "Handsome." Adrienne looked in the mirror. He had an 11 o'clock meeting with the 6 capos who ran his territories, men who read weakness the way sharks read blood. He looked at the lump. He looked at Zoe's face, shining with accomplishment. He wore it. At 11 o'clock, 6 of the most dangerous men in the Midwest filed into the conference room, and each one of them, in turn, looked at the boss's tie. Each one of them then looked very deliberately at the table, the wall, or their own hands, and said absolutely nothing about it for 90 minutes. Vincent Russo, the oldest capo, would later swear he witnessed the boss glance down at the crooked knot, mid-meeting, and touch it, briefly, the way a man touches something he is keeping. The coffee happened on Saturday. Adrienne was reviewing shipping manifests in his study when Zoe navigated the doorway with a cup rattling violently against its saucer, both hands white-knuckled, walking with the extreme slowness of a bomb disposal expert. "I maked you coffee," she said. "By myself. Almost." The almost, Adrienne would learn, referred to the chef lifting the pot. Everything else, including the sugar, had been Zoe. He took the first sip, and his entire nervous system objected. It was not coffee with sugar in it. It was sugar that had briefly encountered coffee. Somewhere north of 10 spoonfuls, syrup thick, aggressively beige with the milk she had added to make it pretty. Zoe watched him with her hands clasped, vibrating with anticipation. Adrienne Romano had endured interrogations. He drained the cup to the last drop, set it down, and told her it was the best coffee ever brewed in this house. Zoe punched the air with both fists and ran off to inform her mother, and Adrienne sat very still for a moment, listening to his own pulse race from the sugar, aware that he was grinning at a shipping manifest. The house noticed everything. The guards, whose profession was noticing, noticed first. They noticed that the marble corridors, which for 7 years had carried only the measured footsteps of professionals, now echoed daily with the slap of tiny bare feet and the drag of a teddy bear's leg. They noticed the boss's shoes. They noticed the tie. Rocco, who worked the east door, told the night shift that he had seen the boss step over a line of stuffed animals arranged across the hallway because they were sleeping. The night shift did not believe him. Then they saw it themselves. The whisper moved through the security teams like weather, careful and astonished. The most feared man in Chicago has learned to smile. Adrienne noticed something too, though it took him longer. He noticed it on the day he ended a call with the Vegas operation 40 minutes early, walked out of his study at 6 o'clock, and could not explain to himself why until he heard Zoe in the kitchen, narrating her drawing to the chef, and felt something in his chest settle into place like a key. He had spent 20 years being the last man awake, the empire's engine that never cooled. Billion-dollar acquisitions had never once made him watch the clock. Now he moved meetings to be home before a 3-year-old's dinner time, and rose before his alarm for the sound of a knock no louder than a bird against wood. The empire had given him everything except a reason to come home. The reason, it turned out, was 10 kilograms heavy and could not pronounce Wednesday. On the last day of that week, Dr. Moretz declared Grace recovered. She dressed for work for the first time in 8 days, walked down the grand staircase feeling like a trespasser in the guest wing's silence, and stopped. Below her, in the middle of the great hall, Adrienne Romano was down on one knee in a charcoal suit, perfectly still, while her daughter retied his tie for the 3rd time. Too loose, Zoe was saying sternly, unraveling her own work. Again, and the man who commanded an empire across an entire country tilted his chin up obediently and said, "Yes, ma'am," while the crooked knot took shape once more under her small hands. Grace stood on the stairs with her hand pressed over her mouth, and understood that she had come back to work in a different house than the one she had fallen sick in, because the man at the heart of it had, somewhere in those 8 days, become someone else entirely. The change did not stay inside the walls of the guest wing. It leaked. It began with a question no one in the Romano organization had ever heard the boss ask. Passing the east door one evening, Adrienne stopped and said, "Rocco, how is your wife's back?" The guard nearly dropped his radio. He stammered out that the surgery had gone well. "Thank you, sir." And Adrienne nodded and walked on, and Rocco stood there for a long moment afterward, wondering how the boss even knew there had been a surgery. Within a month, Adrienne knew the names of the guard's children. All of them. Tomas at the North Gate had twin boys, 7 years old, one of whom stuttered. The gardener's son was applying to community college and could not afford the fees. The night cook had a daughter with asthma and a landlord who refused to fix the mold. Adrienne learned these things because he began asking, and because he discovered to his quiet astonishment that when a man is asked about his children, he will speak about them with a light in his face that no bonus and no bullet ever produced. Then came the fund. It was announced without ceremony on a Tuesday. The Romano Family Education Trust, a sum of money set aside permanently, its interest paying for the schooling, medical care, and university tuition of every child belonging to every person who worked for the family, from the capos down to the woman who scrubbed the kitchen tiles at dawn. Old Vincent Russo, who had served 3 generations of Romanos, read the memorandum twice and then sat down heavily, because in 80 years he had watched this family spend fortunes on lawyers, weapons, judges, and silence, and never once on a child's future. The men did not know what had caused it. Only Grace knew. And Grace was afraid. She found Adrienne in the garden on a gray afternoon, while Zoe hunted for pine cones among the rose beds, filling her pockets with treasure. Grace had rehearsed the words for a week and still had to force them out. "Mr. Romano, I need to say something, and I'm terrified of saying it." He turned. "Say it. You've been..." She searched for a word large enough and could not find one. "My daughter has slept in a warm room with a garden view. She has eaten food from a chef." She knocks on your door every morning like she belongs there. And she's 3, sir. She doesn't understand that people can be borrowed." Adrienne said nothing, which she took as permission. "Your world is guns," Grace said, her voice shaking now, the housekeeper falling away, and only the mother remaining. "It's men who don't come home. I married a man who ran into fire, and I buried what was left of him with a folded flag on my knees while Zoe cried in my arms. I know exactly how fast the ground opens up." Her eyes were wet and furious. "One day this ends. You'll marry, or you'll get bored, or something will happen to you, and my daughter will have learned what warmth feels like just long enough to lose it. I would rather she never knew it at all than have it taken away. So please, if this is pity, if this is guilt, end it now, while she's still young enough to forget." The wind moved through the roses. Across the lawn, Zoe shrieked with delight over a pine cone the size of her fist. When Adrienne finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. 7 years ago, a woman I was going to marry sold everything I told her to my enemies. 3 of my men died in the street because I believed a person could be trusted. I decided that night that every attachment was a weakness, and every weakness was a death sentence. He watched the little girl in the roses. "I have not been wrong about many things in my life, Grace. I was wrong about that, and it took your daughter, standing on a stool she was too small for, ruining a pair of shoes to save your job, to prove it to me." He turned to face her fully. "This is not pity. Pity is what a man gives when he has something to spare. Your child fixed something in me that all my money and all my power could not touch something I did not know was broken until she broke it open." His jaw set. "So hear me, and hear me the way my enemies hear me. My world will never touch Zoe. Not while I breathe. Not in any way. Not for any reason. On that, you have my word." Grace covered her mouth with both hands and wept, and it was the first time in 2 years that she had cried without shame. That evening, Zoe appeared in the doorway of Adrienne's study, which no one entered without invitation. She was holding the teddy bear with the mismatched ear. "For you," she said, thrusting it forward with both arms. Adrienne set down his pen. He knew what the bear was. He had learned, from a comment Grace made once and never repeated, that it was the last thing Zoe's father ever bought her. Purchased on his way home from a shift he was lucky to survive. 3 weeks before the shift he did not. "Zoe," he said carefully, "that's yours. That's the most precious thing you own. I know." She climbed onto the visitor's chair, hoisted the bear onto the desk, and arranged it sitting upright, facing his own chair. "So you not lonely when you work? Mama says you work too late." She patted its head. "He waits with you." The study of Adrienne Romano contained a wall safe holding documents that could destroy 3 senators, a drawer with a loaded pistol, and a bank of monitors showing every entrance to the estate in cold gray light. And now, between the safe and the monitors, sat a shabby brown teddy bear with one ear sewn on crooked, watching over an empire. Adrienne did not move it. Not that night. Not ever. 19 kilometers away, in a warehouse on the south bank where the river smelled of rust and diesel, a very different meeting was taking place. Old Salvatore Moretti sat at a card table under a single hanging bulb, his liver-spotted hands folded, listening to a report delivered in a careful voice. The Romano operation had grown tighter, not weaker. Shipments were moving on schedule. 3 attempts to buy Romano men had failed within a week. "Then he has no crack," said one of Moretti's sons. "He never has." "Wait," said the man delivering the report. He was not one of Moretti's. He had come in through a side entrance, and he would leave the same way, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Something's changed inside the house. Romano goes home before dinner now. Every night. He canceled Vegas twice." Moretti lifted his head slowly. "There's a housekeeper," the man went on. "Grace Williams. He moved her into the main house. And her daughter, a little girl, 3 years old. He drives her." The man hesitated at how absurd it sounded. "He keeps her drawings in his desk. The girl walks into his study whenever she wants. Nobody stops her." The bulb swung gently. The old man's face did not change, but something behind it woke up and stretched. For 20 years the underworld had searched Adrienne Romano for a fracture and found only steel. No wife, no children, no friends, nothing that could be taken from him, because he had made certain there was nothing left to take. It was what made him untouchable. And now, at last, the invulnerable man had gone and given himself too. Salvatore Moretti tapped one yellowed fingernail against the card table, slowly, 3 times. "So," he said, then that is exactly where we strike. The estate did not know it was being hunted, but it had begun to twitch. Small things. Things too small for any single man to notice, and therefore noticed by no one. The rear gate shift, which had run from 8 to 4 for as long as anyone could remember, was quietly redrawn. The changeover moved to 9:15, leaving a seam of 11 minutes each evening when the gate belonged to nobody. Nobody questioned it, because the man who signed the schedule had signed every schedule for 15 years. The camera covering the northeast corner, where the rose garden met the perimeter wall, went dark on a Tuesday night. Maintenance logged a faulty relay. It went dark again on Wednesday. The report never traveled higher than the security office, because the security office was where it stopped. And twice that week, a gray sedan with no plates parked on the far side of the estate wall for exactly 19 minutes, and then drove away. Zoe knew none of this. Zoe knew that Thomas, the North Gate guard, had brought his daughter to the estate for the afternoon, that her name was Lily, that she was 5 and therefore extremely wise, and that Lily had agreed to play hide-and-seek in the garden until the grown-ups called them for dinner. Lily counted at the fountain with her hands over her eyes. Zoe ran. She ran past the stone bench where she was allowed, past the birdbath where she was allowed, and then with the delicious guilt of a rule, not so much broken, as gently stepped over beyond the last row of trimmed hedges, into the wild tangle of old rose bushes at the bottom of the garden. Nobody ever looked there. The thorns kept adults out. The gardeners had given up on that corner years ago. It was, in the professional opinion of a 3-year-old, the greatest hiding place ever discovered by any human being. She crawled into the gap beneath the largest bush, hugged her knees, and went perfectly still, the way you must. Beyond the roses stood the wall, and set into the wall was the rear gate, an old iron thing, wide enough for a delivery truck, painted black. Zoe watched it because it was the only thing to watch, and because she was proud of herself for being so quiet. The light was going amber. Somewhere behind her, Lily shouted the number 16. Then a man walked up to the gate from inside the garden. Zoe knew him. Everybody knew him. It was Uncle Marco, who was always near the front door, who wore the black jacket, who once told her that if she ever got lost, she should find him. Uncle Marco stopped at the gate and looked back over his shoulder, a long look, all the way across the lawn, at the house. Zoe almost waved. She loved being seen. But she was hiding, and rules were rules, so she pressed her lips together with both hands to keep the giggle in. Uncle Marco took out his phone. He held it to his ear for a moment without speaking. Then he reached up and did something to the little box on the gatepost, the box with the lights that always blinked red. The red light went out. He pulled the gate open. A man came in, not one of the uncles from the house. This man was thin and wore black clothes with the hood up even though it was warm, and he did not say hello, which Zoe thought was rude. He walked a few steps into the garden, and lifted a small camera, and began taking pictures, not of the roses. He took pictures of the house, of the doors, of the windows, of the corner where the guard stood, turning slowly, clicking. He took a picture of the driveway. He crouched and took a picture of the ground where the gate met the wall. Then he showed something on his phone to Uncle Marco, and Uncle Marco pointed at the house, twice, and traced a line in the air with his finger from the gate to the terrace doors. Zoe did not understand any of it. To her, it was simply this. Uncle Marco opened the door for a stranger, the way Mama opened the door when the delivery man came, except the delivery man laughed and said good evening, and this man did not, and Uncle Marco kept looking behind him, and the red light was off. She stopped wanting to giggle. The two men stood close together, murmuring, and as Uncle Marco reached out to take back whatever the stranger was holding, his sleeve slid up his forearm, and Zoe saw it clearly in the amber light, the thing she would remember when she had forgotten everything else about that evening. A snake, inked in dark green and black, coiled twice around his wrist, its head lying flat along the back of his hand, its tongue a tiny fork of red. Zoe's eyes went round, because she had a picture book, the one with the shiny pages, and on page 11 there was a snake exactly like that one, curled around a branch, and Mama always made a hissing sound when they got to that page, and Zoe always screamed and laughed. She had never seen a snake on a person before. She wanted very badly to ask Uncle Marco whether it hissed. She had actually shifted her weight to crawl out and go and ask him, one hand on the dirt, one knee lifted, found you. Lily's face burst through the leaves, upside down and triumphant, and Zoe screamed with the pure outrage of the discovered, and the thorns caught her sleeve, and Lily was already running, because now Zoe had to be the seeker, and the world became a chase across the lawn, with the sun going gold behind the house. And by the time Zoe reached the fountain, breathless and laughing and covered in leaves, the gate was closed, the red light was blinking again, and there was no one standing at the bottom of the garden at all. At dinner she ate 3 fish sticks, and forgot about the snake. That same night, Adrienne stood in his study with a folder open on the desk beside a shabby teddy bear. A container had been seized at the Calumet docks, a legitimate container, a legitimate manifest, and yet the federal agents had gone directly to the 3rd pallet from the rear, opened it, and found what they went there to find. That was the second thing. The first thing had happened 40 minutes earlier, and 11 kilometers away. A meeting with the Detroit brokers, arranged 4 days ago in a room where 6 people knew the address, had been photographed from a rooftop by men who were not police. Adrienne closed the folder. 3 times in 2 months. A shipment. A meeting. Now this. 3 coincidences were not coincidences. They were a pattern, and a pattern meant a person. Somewhere in this organization was a man who sat at his table, took his money, called him boss, and sold him by the pound. He turned to the monitors. The estate glowed back at him in cold gray squares. The front gate, the drive, the terrace, the east door. All quiet, all watched, all secure. Adrienne began, in his mind, to build the list. It would be short. It would begin with the men who had known all 3 pieces of information, and it would end with the man who had known them first. He did not begin with the top of that list, because the top of that list was the one name in the world Adrienne Romano would never have written down. In the morning, the great hall was full of light. Zoe sat on the marble floor in a square of sunshine, with her tin of crayons spilled around her in a rainbow, tongue out, brow furrowed in the exact expression she wore when she polished shoes. She was drawing yesterday, because that is what children do with the world. They take it in their small hands and put it on paper, the important parts and the wrong parts all mixed together, having no idea which is which. She chose the black crayon for the gate, the dark blue for the hooded stranger, and then she reached, very carefully, for the green. She came to his study the way she always came now, without knocking, because the knocking was only for mornings and shoes. I drawed something. Adrienne was on the phone with Vincent Russo, quietly instructing him to pull the manifest logs for the last 4 months, without telling anyone why. He lifted one finger. Zoe waited with monumental patience for nearly 6 seconds, then climbed onto the visitor's chair, then onto the desk itself, and laid the paper down directly on top of the shipping documents, beside the teddy bear. "I'll call you back," Adrienne said, and hung up. He looked at the drawing the way he had looked at every drawing that had arrived on this desk over the past 2 months, with the particular seriousness a man reserves for the only art he will ever love. There had been a purple dog. There had been Mama with hair like a sunburst. There had been Adrienne himself, rendered as a black rectangle with legs, which he had privately considered accurate. This one was different. A tall black shape, drawn with a ruler-straight determination. Bars, a gate. Beside it, a man. Beside the man, a second figure in dark blue, its head swallowed by a hood, holding a small square with a circle in the middle. Above them, a lopsided sun going down, and on the first man's arm traced over and over until the wax had built up thick and glossy, the only part of the page she had bothered to perfect, a green snake, coiled twice around the wrist, its head flattened along the back of the hand. A little red fork of a tongue. "That's the man with the snake on his hand," Zoe said, tapping it with a proud finger. He opened the door for the stranger. "I saw it when I played hide and seek." The stranger took pictures of our house and he never said good evening. The room went very quiet. Adrienne did not move. He was aware of the second hand on the clock behind him. He was aware of the teddy bear leaning against the safe, of the sunlight lying across the paper, of his own heartbeat slowing rather than speeding the old, terrible calm that came over him before violence. In the Romano organization, 140 men drew a salary. 22 of them had tattoos. Exactly 1 man in the world wore a green serpent coiled twice around his right wrist, its head resting on the back of his hand. Marco Bellini, deputy chief of security, the man who slept in the room nearest the bosses, the man who held the keys to every gate on the property, who wrote the guard rotations, who reviewed the camera feeds. 15 years of standing between Adrienne and every door he had ever walked through, and once, in a parking garage a lifetime ago, a younger Marco had stepped in front of Adrienne's father and taken a bullet in the shoulder that had been meant for the old man's chest. Adrienne had visited him in the hospital. Adrienne had promised him, at 17 years old, that the Romano family would never forget it. Zoe. His voice came out perfectly level. When did you see this? She counted on her fingers, which meant the answer would be unreliable and honest. When Lily came, I hid it in the thorny bushes. Was the little red light on the gate blinking? Zoe shook her head solemnly. Uncle Marco turned it off. Then he opened the door. Uncle Marco. He had taught her that name himself. If you ever get lost, find me. Something inside Adrienne did not shatter this time. It froze. 2 months ago, in a shoe room, this child had cracked 7 years of ice with a single question, and everything warm in him had come flooding out. Now the same small voice was pouring the ice back in, layer over layer, until the man sitting at that desk was cold enough to do what had to be done. He wanted, with a violence that frightened him, for this to be a mistake. Children confused things. Children invented things. A snake in a picture book. A shadow at dusk. A story stitched together out of nothing. He could take this paper, praise it, put it in the drawer with the purple dog, and go on living in a house where Marco Bellini was still the man who took a bullet for his father. 7 years ago, he had wanted something else to be a mistake too. He had held the first piece of evidence against Isabella in his hand and told himself the same soothing story, and 3 men had died in the street for the sake of his comfort. Never again. It's a wonderful drawing, Adrienne said, and lifted Zoe off the desk and set her on her feet. The best one yet. Go find your mother. He waited until the sound of her feet faded down the corridor. Then he locked the study door. He told no one. Not Vincent. Not the new steward. Not one guard. He worked alone, through channels that existed outside the organization entirely. A forensic accountant in Zurich, who had never spoken his name aloud, a security consultant in Toronto, who was paid in cash and asked nothing, and he began where all men are betrayed, in the records. The guard rotation for the night the Detroit meeting was photographed. Marco had signed himself onto the security office alone from 10 until 2. The maintenance log for the Northeast camera. 2 faults in 1 week, both during Marco's watch, both cleared by Marco's signature, both windows lining up with the gray sedan. A witness at the North Gate remembered, but never reported, because no one had asked. The manifest for the Calumet container. 4 men had known which pallet. Marco had prepared the transport escort. 3 leaks, 3 overlaps. Not one of them proof. All of them together. A shape. The Zurich accountant found the rest in 11 days. An account in the Caymans, opened 5 months ago, in the name of a shell corporation, registered to a nephew's wife. Deposits arriving on the 18th of every month, routed through a construction company in Cicero that laid asphalt for exactly 1 client. The client was a holding firm owned, at the 4th remove, by Salvatore Moretti. Adrienne read the statements at 3 in the morning with the teddy bear watching him from beside the safe. 5 months. Marco had been selling him since spring. Every route, every meeting, every door. And on the last page of what the Toronto consultant recovered, a fragment of a message thread pulled from a burner device Marco had been careless with, exactly once Adrienne found the reason all the leaks had stopped mattering. They had stopped mattering because Moretti no longer needed information. Friday, 9:15. Rear gate. Camera down. 6 men. The boss's wing is the 2nd corridor past the terrace doors. Finish it inside the house. Adrienne sat alone in the dark for a long time. Friday, 2 days. The seam in the shift change that Marco himself had drawn 11 minutes wide. 6 men walking through a gate held open by the man who had bled for his father, into a corridor 2 doors down from where Grace slept, 3 doors down from a little girl who had befriended a snake in a picture book. He had promised Grace, in a garden full of roses, that his world would never touch her daughter. His world had already been in the garden. Adrienne rose. He picked up the crayon drawing from the desk, the crooked gate, the hooded stranger, the green serpent traced over and over by a hand too small to hold a pen properly, and he folded it once, carefully, along the middle. He slid it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, against his chest, over his heart. An empire of 1,000 men and $100 million had not found the traitor at its center in 5 months. A 3-year-old with a box of crayons had just handed him the deadliest weapon in the world. The truth. On Friday afternoon, Adrienne told Grace that he had scheduled a routine medical checkup for her and Zoe at a private clinic on the North Shore, and that they would stay overnight at an apartment the family kept for visiting doctors. He said it while signing a document he was not reading. He said it so lightly that Grace, who had learned to read this man's silences better than anyone alive, felt the hair rise on her arms and asked no questions at all. She packed in 15 minutes. The car waited at the front steps with a driver Adrienne had chosen from among 4 men whose fathers had served his father. Grace climbed in. Zoe hesitated on the gravel, one shoe untied, looking up at him with a small furrow between her brows. Then she turned, ran back, and pushed the teddy bear into his hands. "He stays with you," she said. Adrienne looked down at the shabby bear, the ear sewn on crooked, the fur worn thin by 4 years of a child's fists. "Zoe, you'll want him tonight." "No." She shook her head with total conviction. "You're staying here alone. Bear protects you." She patted the bear's head twice, the way a general blesses a soldier. "Don't be scared." The most feared man in Chicago stood in his own driveway holding a stuffed animal, and could not, for a moment, speak. He watched the car until the gate closed behind it. Then he walked back into the house, and the boss came out. By 6 o'clock, 31 men had been quietly removed from the estate, under a dozen unremarkable pretexts: a training exercise in the city, a wedding, a shift traded. Every man who remained had been personally vetted by Adrienne and Vincent Russo across 2 sleepless nights, chosen by one criterion. He had known nothing about any of the 3 leaks. Marco Bellini was told nothing. He walked the halls all evening exactly as he always had, and Adrienne passed him twice, and nodded at him twice, and said good evening once. 15 years of friendship stood between them in the corridor, and only one of the 2 men knew it was already a corpse. At 8:40, the boss retired to his wing. The lights came on behind his curtains, and his silhouette crossed the window once, and settled into a chair. The silhouette belonged to Vincent Russo's nephew, who was paid extremely well and told to sit very still. At 9:15, in the 11-minute seam that Marco himself had drawn into the schedule, the little red light on the rear gate went dark. Adrienne, standing in the black of an upstairs corridor, watched on a handheld screen as the iron gate swung open and 6 shapes came through it in a low, practiced line. He watched Marco Bellini step aside to let them pass and point toward the terrace doors, and then check his watch, the small, ordinary gesture of a man on a schedule, the gesture that ended everything. The 6 men crossed the lawn. They reached the terrace doors and found them unlocked, exactly as promised. They moved down the second corridor past the doors, exactly as instructed, toward the boss's wing. Then every light in the house went out at once. What followed took 90 seconds, and made almost no noise. The corridor they entered had been chosen for them. The doors behind them closed. The men waiting in the dark were not where the Moretti crew had been told the guards would be, because the Moretti crew had been given the guard positions from 3 weeks ago. There were no gunshots. There was the sound of men being taken to the floor, and the sound of weapons sliding across marble, and then the sound of nothing at all. By 10 o'clock, 6 intruders and every device they carried, phones, a camera, a folded floor plan of a house drawn by a man who had lived in it for 15 years, had been handed over to the channels the family used for such things. And in the great hall, the lights came back on, and Marco Bellini turned around and found Adrienne Romano standing on the stairs holding a teddy bear. They went into the study alone. Adrienne closed the door. There was no shouting. There were no fists. There were 2 men, 1 desk, and a lamp. Adrienne laid the pages down one at a time, unhurried, the way a dealer turns cards. The bank statements from the Caymans, 5 months of deposits, arriving on the 18th. The maintenance log with the northeast camera fault, signed in Marco's own hand, twice. The guard rotation from the night of the Detroit meeting. The recovered message, Friday, 9:15. Rear gate. Finish it inside the house. Marco stood with his jaw locked, his eyes moving over the paper. He did not deny anything. His hands, at his sides, had begun to shake, and the green serpent on his right wrist shook with them. "How?" he said at last. His voice was a ruin. Every root was clean. Every account was buried. "I built the security of this house. I know what you can see and what you can't." He looked up, and there was something almost desperate in it, the last vanity of a professional. "How did you find me?" Adrienne reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, over his heart, and took out a folded square of paper. He opened it, smoothed the crease with 2 fingers, and set it on the desk on top of everything else. A crooked black gate, a hooded figure, a man, and on that man's wrist, traced over and over in wax until it shone, a green snake with a small red tongue. Marco Bellini looked at it for a long time, then his legs gave out, and he sat down in a chair without being invited and put his face in his hands. She was playing hide-and-seek, Adrienne said quietly. She hid in the roses because the thorns keep adults out. She thought your tattoo was from her picture book. She wanted to ask you if it hissed. He let the silence do its work. You taught her to find you if she ever got lost. Adrienne, for 15 years I gave you my trust. My father's life is on your shoulder in a scar. Adrienne's voice never rose, and it was worse than if it had. That little girl needed 1 box of crayons to give me the truth. He turned toward the window and did not look at him again. You are no longer a Romano. You will not be touched under my roof. Beyond it, you belong to the rules of the world you sold me to. The door opened. Marco Bellini walked out of the house he had guarded for 15 years, into a night that had already been arranged for him, and the story of what became of him belongs to men in other rooms. Salvatore Moretti had made one error, and it was the error of a proud old man. He had put 6 of his own soldiers inside a house he did not control, carrying phones he had not cleaned, in order to kill a rival he had never once managed to frighten. By Saturday noon, every neutral family east of the Mississippi had received the same package. Bank records, transport logs, a construction company in Cicero, photographs of Moretti's men crossing another boss's threshold with weapons in a peace year, and a message thread ordering a murder inside a private residence, a thing that the old rules of that world forbade absolutely, for reasons of their own. Adrienne did not fire a shot at Salvatore Moretti. He simply let the world read. Within a month, Moretti's allies were unreachable. His ports were closed to him, and the Council of Families invited him to a table where the chair had already been pulled out. He signed a peace and withdrew from Chicago entirely. An old man with a name that no longer opened doors. Adrienne had won the war without spilling 1 drop of blood on his own floor. He had won it, in the end, with a piece of paper. The car came back through the front gate, a little after 5 in the morning, when the sky over the estate had turned the color of a peach. Adrienne was waiting on the steps. Grace stepped out first, searching his face, and found there something she had never once seen on it. Peace. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and said nothing, because some questions are not asked. Zoe was asleep. He lifted her from the seat, and she came awake just enough to fold herself against his shoulder, one fist curling into his collar. Was you okay? She mumbled into his neck. I was. Her eyes were already closing again. Did Bear protect you? Adrienne looked out across the lawn, across the roses at the bottom of the garden, across the closed black gate where the little red light blinked steadily in the dawn. He did, he said, better than 100 bodyguards. The rebuilding began the following Monday. Adrienne tore the security of the Romano estate down to bare ground and raised it again on a different foundation. Every gate code changed. Every camera feed routed to 2 independent systems, one of which no employee could reach. The guard rotations were no longer written by a single hand. They were drawn by 3 men who did not report to one another. And Vincent Russo, 80 years old and half retired, was asked to come back and watch all 3. When the old capo protested that he was too old for it, Adrienne replied that he had learned something about trust from a 3-year-old, and that he intended never to hand any man the key to a house again. The underworld heard about the purge within a week. They heard that Marco Bellini had been cut out of the Romano family root and branch, that 6 Moretti soldiers had walked into a house and never walked back out on their own, that old Salvatore had signed his name to a peace and taken his weight out of Chicago forever. They repeated it in back rooms from Kansas City to Newark, and they nodded, because that was exactly the kind of story you expected about Adrienne Romano. What they could not make sense of, what genuinely disturbed the sleep of certain men in certain cities, was the other story. The story about the school. Because at 10 minutes to 8, every weekday morning, the black car pulled out of the Romano gates with no driver in the front seat, except Adrienne himself, and in the back, strapped into a child's seat, a small girl in a red raincoat, narrating everything she saw out the window. He parked in the same spot each day, opened her door himself, and walked her to the kindergarten entrance with her lunchbox in one hand and her fist in the other. Then he stood at the gate. He did not get back in the car. He stood, hands in his coat pockets, in the cold or the drizzle, watching until the small red coat had crossed the yard, climbed 3 steps, and disappeared through the classroom door. Some mornings she turned and waved from the top step. On those mornings, Adrienne Romano raised one hand in the middle of a public sidewalk, in full view of 30 parents who had no idea who he was, and 2 bodyguards parked across the street who could not believe what they were paid to witness. The teachers assumed he was somebody's uncle. Somebody quiet, they said, and a little sad around the eyes, but always on time. 6 months moved through the estate like water through a garden, changing its shape. Grace Williams was never permitted to lift a mop again. Adrienne created a position that had not existed in the 90-year history of the household director of the estate, and gave her authority over every person who drew a wage inside those walls: hiring, wages, schedules, grievances. The old guard grumbled for exactly 11 days, until the day Grace overruled a kitchen supplier who had been shorting the house for a decade and saved more money in one afternoon than her salary cost in a year. She became, at 32, the youngest person ever to hold command of the Romano house, and the staff would tell you this in a lowered voice, the most respected. She still folded her own daughter's laundry. She said it kept her honest. Zoe was given a bedroom on the east side, where the sun came in at 7 and lay across the floor in long gold bars until noon. Adrienne had the room next to it converted into a library built for a person no taller than a table. Low shelves, a rug like a green field, a beanbag shaped like a frog, and at the bottom of the garden, where the wild roses had grown thorny and forgotten, a crew spent a week clearing a space and building something. Grace assumed it would be a fence. It was a playground, a wooden fort, a swing, a slide set precisely in the corner where a hidden child had once watched a gate open in the dark. Adrienne never explained why he chose that spot. Grace never asked, but she understood that a man was taking a place that had held fear and filling it, deliberately, with the sound of a child laughing. The house learned to make noise. Someone found a radio in the kitchen and no one confiscated it. The cook began humming. A tricycle appeared in the great hall and was ridden, screaming, from one end of the marble to the other, and the boss stepped around it without comment. And on the first Saturday of each month, the estate opened its gates to the families of the men who guarded it. Wives came. Children came. Rocco's daughters swam in a pool that had gone unused for 7 years. Tomas brought his twin boys, and the one who stuttered spent an entire afternoon being taught to skip stones by a man whose name the boy's father did not dare explain to him. 2 decades of Romano tradition held that no man's family ever crossed that threshold, because families were leverage, and leverage was death. Adrienne abolished it with 3 sentences, and never discussed it again. He had not gone soft. Let no one imagine that. The name Romano still fell across a negotiating table like a shadow. He still ended men's careers with a sentence, and moved sums of money that could tilt a city. The families who had watched him dismantle Salvatore Moretti with nothing but paper understood, better than before, precisely what kind of man they were dealing with. But at 6 o'clock, wherever he was, whatever it cost, Adrienne Romano stopped, because there were 2 people waiting at a table for him, and he had discovered that no deal ever closed in his life had felt like walking into a room where somebody says, "You're late," and means "I'm glad you came home." On a mild evening in the 6th month, Grace found him on the terrace, watching Zoe on the swing at the bottom of the garden, pumping her legs and shouting to be pushed higher by a bodyguard who had entirely surrendered his dignity. Grace stood beside him at the railing. She had been rehearsing again. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "Not for the room, or the title, or the school. For the other thing." She looked straight ahead. "For the night you sent us away and didn't tell me why. I've known since the moment you said the word checkup. You could have used us as bait. Men in your world would have. You put us in a car instead, and you stood there alone." Adrienne watched the swing rise. "You misunderstand what happened that week," he said. "You think I protected you. Didn't you?" "A little girl handed me a drawing," he said. "That is all. Everything after it was arithmetic." He turned to look at her, then at the woman who had scrubbed his floors while burning with fever rather than ask a favor. "You carried an entire world on your back for 2 years, Grace. A dead husband, a baby, a job that would have discarded you the moment you faltered. And in all that time you never once complained, and you never once let your daughter see you afraid." His voice dropped. "The strongest person in this house has never been me." Grace did not answer. She could not. She set her hand on the stone railing to steady herself, and after a moment Adrienne's hand came to rest beside it, not touching. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of it across the small gap of cool stone. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked down. Below in the garden, Zoe soared into the last of the light, shrieking with joy, and the two adults stood side by side in the dusk, with their hands not quite touching, and let it be enough. Some things do not need to be hurried. They had time now. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in the 8th month. Adrienne sat on the low bench in the shoe room with a black Oxford balanced on one knee, sleeves rolled to the elbow, working the brush along the leather in slow, even strokes. He had a meeting downtown at 4. He had polished his own shoes exactly once in the last 20 years, and he had discovered, to his surprise, that he liked it, the smell of the wax, the rhythm of it, the small, honest satisfaction of a thing made better by hand. Small feet came pounding down the corridor. "No," Zoe said, arriving at full speed and seizing the brush out of his hand with the authority of a customs officer. "I do it. You have homework. I'm 4. She had turned 4 in the spring, an event the entire security team had attended, and she deployed the fact in every negotiation. Homework is for big kids. She climbed onto the bench beside him, hauled the shoe into her lap, and set to work. Her hands were steady now. Her strokes went heel to toe without wandering. There was not a single smudge on her fingers. Adrienne watched her, and something in his chest ached pleasantly. "You still remember," he said, "how to do this." "I remember everything." Zoe did not look up. "I remember the first time, when Mama was sick and I did it at night, and I was so scared." She buffed the toe with the corner of the cloth, thoughtful. "I thought you were going to send my mama away. That's why I did it. So you wouldn't." The brush moved. Outside, the garden was full of late gold light, the swing motionless, the roses heavy on their stems. Zoe stopped and looked up at him with those enormous dark eyes. "Sir, why did you cry that day?" Adrienne took a long breath. He had been asked hard questions by police commissioners, by federal prosecutors, by men holding weapons. None had ever required more of him. He set the second shoe down and turned so he could face her properly. "Because a very small girl was doing a grown man's job in the middle of the night," he said. "Not to get anything. Not because she wanted money, or favors, or safety for herself. She did it so that her mother would not lose her job. She was terrified of me, and she did it anyway." He paused. "In all my life, nobody had ever done something for me and wanted nothing back." Zoe listened with the fierce solemnity of a child being told the truth. "That day," Adrienne said, "I looked around this enormous house, and I understood something. I had an empire. I had money that could not be counted in one lifetime, and I had never, not for one single day, had a home." She thought about that. Then she put down the brush, climbed into his lap, wrapped both arms around his neck, and pressed her face against his collar. "I won't let you be lonely anymore," she said into his shirt. Adrienne closed his eyes and held her, this child who had walked into his life on a Tuesday night and dismantled 7 years of ice with a tin of shoe polish. "Neither will I," he said. Grace found out 3 weeks later, and entirely by accident. The family lawyer, a cautious old man named Whitcomb, left a folder on the side table in the hall while he took a phone call in the driveway. Grace, passing with a vase of cut roses, saw her daughter's name printed on the tab in small, clean letters, and stopped the way a person stops when they hear their own name in another room. Zoe Williams. She should not have opened it. She opened it. The first document was a trust, established quietly, funded quietly, growing quietly since the spring. The figure at the bottom of the page had so many places in it that Grace had to count them twice with her finger, and when she reached the end, she set the vase down on the table because her hands had stopped working. Education, housing, medical care. Every provision written so that the money could never be touched by anyone, including Adrienne himself, and could never be taken from Zoe by any court, any creditor, or any man. The second document was thinner. It was a petition for legal guardianship, prepared, notarized, and held in reserve. It named Adrienne Romano as the person who would raise Zoe Williams as his own child in the event that Grace Williams should die, or be incapacitated, or in any way be unable to care for her daughter. He had signed it in the winter. He had never mentioned it. Not once. Not on the terrace, not at the dinner table, not on the night he sent them away in a car and stood alone in a house waiting for 6 men to come through a gate. Grace lowered herself into the hall chair. For 2 years, she had been a woman nobody saw, a widow with a folded flag in a drawer, a pair of hands that made rooms clean, and then withdrew. She had lain sick, and burning in a cottage behind a mansion for 2 days, believing all the way down to her bones that if she stopped being useful, the world would simply set her outside like a chair nobody wanted anymore. And a man the entire underworld feared had, without saying a word, without asking for gratitude, without ever once making her feel like a charity, quietly written her daughter into his life forever. She had never been invisible in this house. Not for a long time. She had simply been too afraid to look up and see it. Grace Williams put her face in her hands, alone in the great hall, and wept. That evening, the sun came down over the estate the color of warm honey. Adrienne walked out through the terrace doors with Zoe riding on one arm, her legs swinging, chattering about a boy at school who claimed that snakes had ears. Grace stood at the railing with her eyes still red and watched them go down into the garden, the man in the dark suit, the little girl, the two of them arguing seriously about snake anatomy among the roses. The black leather shoes on Adrienne's feet caught the last light and shone, polished by small, careful hands, flawless now, the brightest shoes in Chicago. But the shoes had never been the treasure. The treasure was the weight of a child on his arm, and a woman waiting for him on the terrace, and a house behind him, with a radio playing in the kitchen. The treasure was the sound of laughter in a place that had known none for 7 years. A man who had owned power and money and the fear of an entire city had finally found the one thing his empire could never buy: a family, a real one. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead, and may you always have a home to return to, and people waiting there who are glad you came back. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, tap the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support allows us to keep bringing you touching stories like this one every single day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.